I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
This is the Simply Love Jesus podcast, where we explore life and faith through the lens of one question, which is, what does it mean to simply love Jesus? My name is Caleb, and we are in a series called Let's Talk About Race. And so the point of this podcast series is we wanted to take a break from our regularly scheduled series and all the different things we had planned. And we just have had a lot of heavy stuff going on in our community, a lot of heavy stuff in our country. And we wanted to take a moment to pause and to talk about it, because it's important that we talk about these things. And so instead of just me and Griffin, Micah, and Jacob, instead of us being the ones who would usually talk on this podcast and talk about issues because of our natural ethnicity being not black, we thought it would be way more appropriate that I would just bring on a couple of my close friends who are in the black community, who do see these issues firsthand from a completely different perspective than I have, and would be able to shed way more perspective and light on this. And so last two episodes actually, we talked with our friend Datreon, and so I was super excited to have him on the podcast. If you haven't heard it yet, then go back and listen to it. It's super fun, super casual, and he just brings a really great perspective from his end of things. But today and this week, and what will end up being 2 episodes, I believe, we have my friend Mike Haynes. And so Mike Haynes runs a youth ministry curriculum called G Shades. He's a pastor, he's a speaker, he's a writer, he does all sorts of crazy things. But that being said, Mike, for our listeners who don't know you, do me a favor and just brag on yourself for a little bit. Like, who are you? What do you do? Give us your spiel. Go.
Cool. Yeah. So I am a youth pastor at a church in Virginia. That is my full-time gig. I love it. And I feel like it is my life's calling. It's all I've ever really wanted to do is work with middle and high school students. I've had that passion since I was a high school student myself. The only thing, in fact, I've ever wanted to do professionally was work in the youth ministry world. Actually, I guess the caveat to that, before that, I did want to play for the Lakers. And I think, honestly, you say brag on yourself, I really believe that I could have gone pro. And I definitely think I could have gone pro. The only things that were holding me back is that I wasn't good enough, I wasn't tall enough, and I wasn't particularly interested in working hard enough. And those are really the only things I think that held me back from going pro. So, but yeah, outside of that, all youth ministry all day. Love it.
Love that. So you say you work as a youth pastor. What church do you work at again?
Yeah, it's called Christian Fellowship Church, which I lovingly call generic Christian church. And just because it's such a generic Christian church name, I freaking love it. It's so fun. But yeah, it's just a church in a mid-sized church in Ashburn, Virginia is where I'm at, about 45 minutes outside of Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's awesome. So tell me more about the church. Like, is it it's like a Baptist church, Pentecostal church? Is it what? Tell me about your church some more.
Yeah, definitely. So it's non-denominational in the truest sense of the word. Non-denominational in church world often means that you have roots in one particular denomination, but you wanted to attract more than just people who love that denomination. So you call yourself non-denominational, even though your theology is pretty much rooted in one denomination.
Yeah.
But this church is truly non-denominational. And so obviously, depending on the senior pastor and leadership and stuff like that, there might be some aspects of Christianity that the church focuses on a little bit more, or leans on a little bit heavier, or doctrines or whatever, but it really is not terribly dogmatic in a whole lot of areas, and I actually really like that. The older I've gotten, the more comfortable I am with churches not being overly dogmatic in one particular area or another. So I love that. Ashburn is a reasonably diverse area. Our church probably doesn't quite reflect the racial diversity of our area as well as we want it to. But our church is probably 65 or 70% white. And then with Black, Hispanic, Asian, and some Indian mixed in there as well. So that's kind of the general makeup of our church.
That's awesome. And so how'd you get there? Because were you raised in that area or?
Yeah, no, actually I was. I went to high school in this area. I moved from Massachusetts at the end of middle school, and then wound up settling down. Family settled down in Ashburn, and I did high school there. And so I moved away, for college, did the college thing, and then worked at a church elsewhere for a couple of years, and then just crazy set of circumstances. I wound up back home, and I didn't want to wind up back home, but it was just very clear that that's where God was leading us to go. And even though I didn't really want to move back here, it was kind of like my fallback. I am so great. It's like one of those things where you're like, wow, God really knows what he's doing. Because this is exactly the church environment that I needed to heal from some of the stuff that happened at the church that I was at before. And this has just been a perfect environment for me to grow and thrive and really come into my own youth ministry. So it's been great.
That's awesome. So tell us more about, I guess, like your story. Tell us about your story. Where has God led you to how has God led you to where you are today? Tell us a little bit about just your journey, if you're good with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I grew up, I'm gonna tailor this a little bit toward race, just because that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
If I told my full story, it would take about 3 hours. But we don't have that kind of time. And so I'm gonna kind of share the story, if that's okay, of me growing up.
Yeah, go for
Black, pursuing ministry, all that kind of stuff. So, I grew up in a suburban, upper middle class area. I've really never, and so I think that's important to note on the front end of me sharing my experiences growing up, and is that I really have I have existed in privilege. My privilege just hasn't been white privilege. But just because it's not racial doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think that's worth noting.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's kind of part of my story, is that my parents just professionally have done well. And so we always were in upper middle class areas and things like that, which is Ashburn is that now. And so that's a big part of my story. Another part of my story, and it might be tangentially related to that, maybe, but I've always been an Oreo. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with the term, I don't want to assume everyone's familiar, but like an Oreo is the idea, like you're black on the outside, but you're white on the inside, just like an Oreo. And ever since I was a kid, man, that's just the way that I have been. And so being called that all my life, I think for me, now in 2020, after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and the things that are happening right now, saying that feels weightier now than it felt back then. Back then it felt fine. It felt normal. I laughed at it. It did require me to figure out some of my identity formation stuff at a young age. Like, am I Black enough to belong with my culture, with my people, or do I have, I don't belong with Black people. I don't belong with white people. So there was a little bit of that. But I don't think there was anything overtly racist about it. It didn't feel that way at the time, at least. There was nothing hurtful in that. And so one of the things, though, that was tough with that growing up is that occasionally it felt like when a white person would say to me, "Oh, wow, you're an Oreo," or "You're such an Oreo," or something like that. It felt like what they were really saying was, "Oh, you're actually you're pretty white on the inside. Okay, you're safe. You're one of the good ones. You're one of the good Black people. You're a non-threatening Black person." And so it's this idea of growing up with the skin color that I have. I've gotten used to being perceived as a threat until I prove that I'm not.
Wow.
And so that's just a very real part of growing up Black in America. And it's not that it's every day. It's not that it's Jim Crow South. I mean, it's not that, right? But it's often enough that I've gotten used to it, right? It's often enough that it could happen in a day, and I don't even think to tell my wife about it later because it's just it's just kind of normal to me, and it shouldn't be, but that's the point, right? It's just normal. So yeah, a couple of other small pieces of experiencing some racism. I've never experienced police brutality, but back when I was a teenager, I got pulled over by a cop for no reason. I was on my way to a buddy's house, and I was driving my mom's car. My mom had a Jaguar at the time, and so I was driving my mom's car. I got lost. This was before the days where everyone had an iPhone, so I didn't have Google Maps on my phone or Waze or anything like that, and I got lost on my way to my friend's house, and I was in this back area, lost, trying to figure out how to get out, and a cop pulled me over and basically continued along a line of questioning of like, "Are you a drug dealer?" You know?
Oh wow!
I'm like, no, I'm not a drug dealer. Like, I have a Bible in my backpack. Do you want to see? You know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it just stuff like that kind of thing has happened. You know, I've been in a store before and have the store owner follow me around, or, you know, had people follow me around or keep their eyes on me. You know, I could feel them watching me because they think I'm going to steal something. Like, I stole a cookie one time when I was 6 years old on accident from CVS. And when I found out, I cried and asked my dad to take me back to the store so we could pay for it. So that's my experience with stealing. And, you know, I've seen women clutch their purse walking by me on the street. You know, I've been told at a previous church, you know, I was on staff and doing the youth pastor thing. And, you know, I've had pastors tell me that I can't wear braids, which I can't wear braids because if I wear braids, then everyone's going to perceive me as a thug. And they just didn't want to deal with that, right, as pastors. And so rather than that being an opportunity for as senior leadership of the church to say, to shepherd our flock and say, you know what, actually, that's wrong of you to assume that our youth pastor is a thug just because he's wearing braids right now, right? Instead of shepherding them through that, their response was, yeah, let's just let the racism go, and you just kind of don't be part of your culture anymore. You know what I mean? Like, just don't do that. And so those are just very, very small instances for me of what it's been like growing up in America. And none of that is like earth shattering. None of that is like the end of the world. None of that is a huge deal. But I think that's kind of the point. Like, racism isn't just police killing people in the streets. It's also these little, almost imperceptible things that happen every day that we barely even think about, or we barely even notice. Yeah,
I think it's, you know, I think it was Greg Rochelle once said that small steps lead to big changes. And I think in the same way, it's small, subtle influences that lead to big bias, if we're phrasing that in a different context.
It is, yeah. That's good. That's a good word.
A couple questions for you as I was just listening to your story. And one is, you mentioned how you grew up with a little bit of privilege, because you said you grew up in a suburban home and a pretty just middle class, middle to middle upper class. And you're, you know, what was it that you said your parent, I don't know if you mentioned this, but what was it that your parents did for a job?
Oh, my mom is in the financial world, and so she's been, you know, VP level or CFO level for a while. And my dad has always been in ministry.
Okay.
So he's making a modest income, but my mom is she's just a really driven, successful, kind of person. So,
what about your grandparents? Like, were you really connected with your grandparents growing up?
Moderately. I envy it when people talk about, oh, you know, my grandpa was the, you know, one of the biggest influences in my life. It's never been a relationship like that level. But my grandfather, my dad's dad, was super instrumental in a lot of the 60s and the civil rights movement. He was a, you know, personal friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. And in fact, I have pictures saved on my phone of them two marching together in Boston.
Oh, wow.
And so it's, they're like, he and I were were close in that I would see him, 5 or 6 times a year, and he would make me go weed his garden, and share lots and lots and lots of stories. But yeah, in terms of like, yes, I'm close to my grandparents, but not super, super close. Just really admiring from a distance.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that, I just got done watching this video this past week it's all about like helping define and helping people like me understand like what is systemic racism. And so it goes on to like basically, like the example they use is like they have these 2 kids, and you're like, one kid's parents has like, I can't remember the example they use, but it's like one kid's parents has came up with plenty of opportunities, and because of where they lived, they use this kid named Jamal and a kid named Kevin, and they live in almost the same neighborhood, and all of Kevin's friends are white and all of Jamal's friends are black, but because Jamal's district lives in one area of the town, it's not very well funded and the teachers are underpaid, and because of that you have these different hurdles that make it more and more difficult for that kid to get to different opportunities. But because of a different way a city is drawn, you have the white kid who has had a better funded school with tutors and all this stuff. And it talks about this like this systemic racism and like the different ways their grandparents like grew up in their different generations. So my main question was kind of just thinking like, you grew up in one part of town where you feel like you're a little bit more privileged, and your parents, they had good, decent paying jobs and stuff like that. And so that I was asking, thinking of your grandparents. Okay, like where did your grandparents come from? And just seeing if there was any correlation of what I just recently learned and how all that stuff works. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah,
but.
I mean, on my dad's. So it's just going to be a little confusing, but a little bit. So my dad's dad, who I just talked about, is not my dad's biological father, but more so his adopted father, a man who took him in as his own at some point when my dad was a teenager, pretty early on. And so my dad's biological mother, she is from way deep in Mississippi. And so that's where my dad was born. And so my dad talks about, when he was born, he remembers being out in the cotton fields, and that's just kind of what his family did for work. And so particularly on my dad's side, that there definitely was that like just destitute work in the cotton fields, not because they were slaves, but because their parents or their grandparents or, kind of came from slavery. And so, there's definitely some of that where the affluence that's in my family is first generation affluence. It's not it. So it just happens to be that my parents weren't part of the statistic, right? They made it out, if you will.
Yeah. No, it's very enlightening. I recently watched this video and it was very, very fascinating to me. I just had all this stuff kind of explained in a way I hadn't seen it that way before. So I was like, oh, this is fascinating. It's like, it kind of erases some, or enlightens things a little bit more for me. But anyways, so another question I had, you brought this up a little bit earlier as you were talking about being like an Oreo. And I remember growing up in high school and you even using that term a lot. And usually for me, it was the idea of like, for me, it was using that term was like describing someone. And when I think of an Oreo, like the very first thing I think of personally is like me and another guy who's black, and we're at Hot Topic and we're talking about the latest death metal screamo concert, or we both watched like anime and we're both watching Naruto or whatever. And it's like there's like these little things. That's what usually I use to describe it. And it's just interesting because even with all this stuff coming up, there are ways that I've looked at. I haven't even thought of that term in a long time, but now you've made me rethink that term a little bit. Like, oh man, what does go in this? And it goes into like culture, and it goes into like things like, okay, but why is it that we give a label of that to this person and not other people, when like it's just, I don't know if that makes sense at all, but it's like my brain rattled, and like I'm starting like all the millions of idea and things and connections are firing off, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, oh, I didn't even realize. It's like I was like putting some connections together.
One day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Honestly, what it reminded me of was, did you ever watch Fresh Prince of Bel-Air growing up?
Yeah.
It
sure.
reminds me, there was a specific episode, something that you were talking about. It reminds me of an episode where Carlton, this guy who was like this thug, kind of claimed that Carlton wasn't black enough. And that just, it instantly reminded me of that episode. And so my question to that is, how has, maybe even through recent events, but maybe it's been a longer process, but how has your identity in your ethnicity changed? How has it evolved or been shaped over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was younger, it felt like there was this need that if you're black, then to be part of the black culture means that you're really into hip hop. And it means that, you have fantastic rhythm, which I do not. There's all these things that are attached to it, right? But a lot of it kind of stems from hip hop culture. And I just have never, it's just never been my, it's just never really been my thing. And I think getting older, both more mature, more self-confident, and just kind of comfortable in my own skin, but also I think getting older and becoming an adult, in a father, in a husband, I think there's parts of that where I'm just like, yeah, I mean, I am a black man, and there are things about the thing that makes me black is the color of my skin. And maybe there are some other little things here and there, but it just doesn't seem to. There are people who will disagree with me on this, and I think that's totally fine. But the way that my identity has shifted, like as I've grown up, is I'm like, my race is not my primary identifier. Like it's not my core identity. My most core identity is that I'm a son of God. And then race is way down the list after that. And so while other people might look at me and immediately define me based on my race, for me, race just isn't that big of a core identifier. I know it is for some people, and I think that's okay. But I think for me, it's just really way down on the list, and I'm very comfortable with that.
That's interesting. And which actually kind of leads me into my next question. Tell us about how you came to know Jesus. How did you, what was that moment for you, or what led to that moment where you were like, my identity is in Christ? I tell our high schoolers at Westwind, I told them this when I first moved here almost 3 years ago. And I told them that your identity in Christ is the compass to your identity in life. And so it's this idea that like your identity in Christ should be the thing first and foremost. It is the compass, the thing that points you in the direction to help you find your identity within life. And so in the same way, like what was it for you that led you to know who Jesus is, to love him, and to want to know who he is as a person, and really to find your identity in him?
That's so good. Yeah. So my dad is a pastor. My grandfather, the one I spoke of earlier, pastor. And so I grew up, about as churched as you can be. So if you ask my parents, I placed my faith in Jesus when I was 4, but for me, just because that's my story, and because I've quote unquote always known Jesus, I've really tried to pay very close attention to in my narrative, like, okay, but when did I really start to pursue a relationship with Jesus? Because there was no moment where I was kind of like, there was no moment where I was like, I'm a sinner in need of Jesus. Actually, because I grew up in church, there were like 6 or 7 of those moments where I placed my faith in Jesus.
Progressive revelation.
Yeah, that's yes. So it is. It feels like it almost feels like progress. So basically what I always say in my story is when I got to high school, when I moved to Virginia, I got plugged into a youth group where it was the first time that I saw kids my age who seemed to have an active relationship with the God of the universe. It wasn't just head knowledge, and it wasn't just faking like they were being good kids. It wasn't just being good kids and having a lot of head knowledge about the Bible. There was a relationship there. And that really opened my eyes to there is a Jesus here that is worth loving with my heart. I would say somewhere in that freshman year of high school, I really started pursuing Jesus. And that's where I started to see my character change too. I talk about being an Oreo, and that's true. But one of the parts of like Black culture growing up I grew up I was a kid in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And so growing up as a kid in that time period, it was an enormous part of Black culture to like diss people, like dissing people, cracking on people, making fun of people. That was just an enormous part of it, right? That was, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar. You and I are right around the same age, so maybe you're familiar with Wild 'N Out.
Yeah.
MTV show that was out, Nick Cannon, right? That it was like Wild 'N Out came out. It was fresh when I was a kid. And it was everything, right? You make fun of people and everybody laughs and it's a fun time. And it's just how you, and when I got to high school, I get around these other group of kids who like genuinely love Jesus, and their way of showing love to one another was to build one another up, not tear each other down. Yeah. And for the first time in my life, I started to feel like that was the cool thing. That's where my identity started to shift from I need to be as Black as I can so that I fit in with everyone around me to I just want to be more like Jesus, right? Because these other kids around me are more like Jesus, and I want to be like that because what they're doing is awesome. Yeah. And so I feel like that early high school period was where I really started to take some steps forward in loving Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and let me follow it up with this question. So as you're we have a similar story in the sense there's this more progressive revelation understanding in Christ, and there are these key moments throughout your life. So for people like us, I like to then rephrase the question this way, and less of a salvation moment, but more about when was the first time you felt like your faith was challenged? Like if you remember, when was the first time you truly felt like your faith and what you knew about God was actually being challenged, and that helped form your individuality in your beliefs, and that you started making your own intellectual decisions and understandings of God, if that makes sense?
Yeah. When I was a sophomore, I had a crush on a girl, and she had a crush on me. And we started doing the boyfriend girlfriend thing, but she wasn't a Christian. And I knew in my head that, that I wanted to marry somebody who shared my faith values. And I felt like it was wrong to date somebody who I knew we weren't going to get married unless they came to faith in Jesus. And I didn't want that to be the reason that they came to faith in Jesus, was just so they could have me, because I wanted them to have Jesus. Yeah. Want Jesus because they want Jesus, right? So I was really struggling with that. But kind of independent of them, that relationship forced me to mature. It was the first time that in my faith, I had to like make a conscious decision to choose Jesus over something else that I really, really wanted. And that made some sense to me in some other areas. Like we got along really well, me and this girl. We were a pretty good fit together. Yeah. And the only thing that was standing in the way, for me, of like us living happily ever after, of course, I'm 15. What do I know, right? But the only thing that was standing in the way was that she doesn't love Jesus. Yeah. But my interactions with her were causing me, because of my own shame, not because of her pressure, but because of my own shame, I started lying to my parents about where I was going, because I didn't want them to know that I was going to see this girl, because I didn't want them to know that she wasn't a believer. And then it was going to be all these questions. I was going to feel guilty. And so I just started, it almost felt like I started this duplicitous kind of lifestyle where, again, me and her, we weren't, there was nothing wrong with her. We weren't like crossing sexual boundaries. We weren't like, it was just a good, but it was it was the first time where I ultimately wound up deciding, you know what, I choose Jesus. I choose Jesus. And I didn't necessarily handle that breakup with the most grace because I was immature. But it was the first time in my life that I kind of was like, you know what, I'm going to choose Jesus, even though I wish that I didn't have to almost, but I'm going to choose Jesus here. And so that, I feel like that was the first test for me. Another one was college, just going through and learning the apologetic stuff and really questioning, like, is this true or is it just convenient to believe it? And so I think that was another one for me.
Oh yeah. And I mean, these are those moments where you really get to make your faith known to people, because I can imagine someone who doesn't believe in Jesus would listen to that and they would say, why is it a big deal if you believe in God but she doesn't? Like, you're just going to break up with her because she doesn't believe in Jesus? And the answer is yes, because you love Jesus more.
Yeah.
That will baffle any person who doesn't believe in Jesus. And the reality is we have so much more joy, so much more hope, so much more life that is found in knowing Jesus. And the reality is that like people are attracted to what they're missing out on. And my hope, and I'm sure your hope, and my hope for you is that each and every person who believes in Jesus, they would live their life in a way that teaches others they're missing out on something if they don't have Jesus. And so that's really the challenge is that like, I love Jesus more than I love this girl. And if her faith doesn't agree with mine, then I will choose Jesus and I'll sacrifice that. And my hope is that in the midst of that, anyone who hears that and sees that, even if you're listening to this podcast right now, it's the reality that, man, you are missing out on something if you don't have Jesus. Love to thank Chill Hop Music. They have allowed us to use their music on our podcast, and all they ask is that we just give them some credit. So this comes from the Chill Hop Essentials Summer 2020 album, and it's super great, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it so far.